Hello, today we're going to learn about how to make a very basic calculator using Python. So far, we've learned how to do a lot of things in Python, including how to use conditional statements, how to take user input, how to use functions, and everything else you'd need to make a very basic, simple calculator project. And that's what we're going to do today. We're finally going to put together all of the skills we've learned, but if you're new here, I suggest checking out the other videos. We talk about everything you need to build this project. But first, before we start the project, I want to talk about a new sort of programming concept that we haven't talked about in previous videos, and that's just comments. We're going to use those to break down the programming project and break it into parts that we can understand. So what comments are basically just exactly what they sound like. They're comments that you can put throughout your code that the code compiler doesn't actually read. It's sort of, you can write them as English or pseudocode type things that just sort of help you understand programming or the program that you're writing. So the way you do it in Python is just by having a hashtag, and basically you can just write whatever you want here. And if we run a program, nothing happens because the compiler is told to ignore all of the lines with comments. So we're going to write comments to break down our program. So let's think about what a calculator is actually supposed to do. What we want our calculator to do is take some input from the user. Let's say the first number, the second number, and an operation. And then based on that operation, our code is going to decide what to do with those two numbers. So let's break it into three different parts. The first part is going to be taking input from the user. And we can say two numbers and a operation. So that'll be the first part. The second part is going to be the conditional statements that decide what to do with the operation. So we can just say we want to figure out what operation the user is asking for. So let's just write that. What operation is the user asking for? And then the final thing is what to do with that operation. So that's where we're going to write our functions that decide or that handle all the different operations, what to do with that operation. And so these comments don't actually affect our code necessarily. They just sort of help us in the way we approach the problem, the way we break it down, and the way we understand it. So the very first thing that we're going to do is take our input from the user. And if you remember from our user input video, we just write the word input and then parentheses, and we invoke that function. So let's create a variable to store our first number and say input parentheses. And if you also watched that video, you'd know the input function can take the parameter of two quotation marks or like a string, and basically you can enter a term there or a phrase. So we're going to go ahead and say enter the first number and then colon space. And I'll just copy this line and I'll paste it, and we'll say num2 is equal to input, and we'll change it to enter the second number. And then finally we want to take the operation from the user, so we'll say that's equal to input, enter the operation, and colon space. And just to make sure this is working, we'll do a print statement, and we'll just print out num1, num2, and operation. And basically this is just to make sure that this third of the program is going to work, because typically when you work on bigger projects, you don't want to sort of integrate a bunch of different things at once, not knowing if the individual part will work. So we want to make sure that this first part is going to work completely. So we'll run this program, and it says enter the first number, we'll say 7, second number 9, and the operation will say addition. So there we go. So we know this part of the program works because it printed 7, 9, and then plus. So we can go ahead and get rid of this print statement here because that's not actually what we're going to use in the program. And we can move on to the second part. The second part is figuring out what operation the user is actually asking for. So to do that, we have to use a series of conditional statements. So we can first ask the question, is the operation equal to addition? So basically you'll notice a couple of things here. Again, remember the double equal sign, because on lines 2, 3, and 4, we're using one equal sign to show assignment. We're assigning the value of input, or whatever the result of the input is, to the variable num1, the result of the input here to num2, and the result of the input here to operation. Versus on line 7, we're asking the question, is the variable operation equal to plus sign? And remember, whenever we use the input function, the input is always taken as a string, the things between the quotation marks, remember that. And basically that's why we have to put it in quotation marks here, and we can't just say this, because the computer won't understand that. It understands it as a string. So now inside of this conditional statement, we'll just say print add, because we're not sure what to do with that yet, but let's do elif, which means again else if. So in the situation where operation is not equal to plus sign, we can check if operation is equal to the subtraction symbol. And the order of these doesn't matter, by the way. It all goes through sort of the same logic. And then in this scenario, we can print subtract, and then finally, or not finally, sorry, we'll say elif operation is equal to, we'll say division, then we can print the division symbol, or we'll just print the word division to be consistent. And here we sort of have two options. We can say else, and we can do print multiplication, or we can say elif operation equals the multiplication symbol, then print multiplication. But you have to notice they both sort of mean different things. If we say else, and then colon, and then print multiplication, then basically it means that no matter what the user enters, as long as it's not an addition symbol, subtraction symbol, or division symbol, then we're going to print multiplication. So that's a little dangerous. That means if the user, for example, enters the letter K or the number 0, our calculator might understand that as the multiplication operation. Versus if I type elif and operation equals multiplication symbol, then and only then when the user enters the star symbol will the multiplication operation sort of be triggered. And this is where we can add a little bit of error handling in our program. We can say else, and then we can say print, we can print invalid operation entered. And so you could do this for even the number input as well, but since this is a very basic calculator, we're not going to have extensive error handling. But basically, if you remember sort of the way the conditional statement logic works, we check if it's a addition symbol. If it's not, we'll check if it's a subtraction symbol. If it's not, we check if it's a division symbol. If it's not that, we'll check if it's a multiplication symbol. And if it's not any of those, then we know it's not an operation that we can do. So we'll print invalid operation entered. So we can go ahead and actually try this. So we can check, let's enter 9, 0, and then we'll enter plus. And so yeah, it printed add, so we know it successfully got here. And you could sit here and you can do it for all of them, but we won't test everything. Let's just test, let's see if the invalid input works. So I'm gonna enter the letter K. Yeah, so it says invalid operation entered, so we know our error handling is sort of working there. So the very last part of the calculator that we need to do is the actual functions. So right here we just have print add, but that's not actually gonna work. What we could do instead is we could probably say in here, we could say print num1 plus num2. That would work. And so let's just try that for a second. Let's say the first number is 1, the second number is 2, and the operation is add. That works. Oh, that didn't work actually. So what you need to know is that when you're printing something and you add them together, the computer is going to see it as you're adding two strings together. So that's another part of the program that we need to add, which is just converting everything to integers. So let's actually do that right after we take the input. We need to convert things to integers. So let's add a quick comment, convert to integers, because remember, like we were saying, the function input always takes things in as a string. So what we need to do is we need to say num1 is equal to int of num1, and then we do it for num2 as well, int. And then obviously, like with more complex programs, like with better calculators, you could do it with floats, which again are just numbers with decimal points. But since this is a simple calculator, we're not going to go that far. And then finally, we don't need to do anything with the operation. That'll stay a string. But now this would work. So if we do it like this, we'll say 1, 2, and then plus. Yeah, so that would work there. But to be sort of more, this will make more sense when you get to bigger projects, because this is a like sort of better practice. But we want to make sort of functions to handle addition. So that's what we're going to do. And it's good practice as well. So we can say down here on line 23, we can say def add, and then we'll take in the parameters of num1 and num2. And then what we want to do is just return num1 plus num2. Okay, so we just wrote the first function, and basically we need to write the rest of our functions. So they're pretty much going to be the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and keep copying them over. And instead of this being add, we'll make it subtract. And we keep the input, or we keep the parameters the same, except this time, instead of adding the numbers, we're going to return the two subtracted numbers. And then we're going to make a function called multiply, or let's do divide, because that's the same order we did before. And then we'll return num1 divided by num2. And then we'll make a function called multiply, and we'll return the two numbers multiplied. And so this should all work. So now all that needs to happen is on lines 12, 14, 16, and 18, instead of printing the word multiplication, what we need to print is the result of calling the add function. Now remember, just returning something in a function won't actually print it. So what we need to do is return this result here, and that's going to be returned to wherever we call the function. So if we call the add function right here, and we pass in the values of num1 and num2, what's going to be returned is the result of adding those two numbers, and then our print function is going to print them. And you'll notice something I'm seeing here is that it's saying undefined name add. So a lot of times what happens is when programs iterate through a file, what they do is they read over all the functions and they store those definitions of functions. So right now what the program is looking at is it's seeing nothing above it that's telling it how to add. So actually what we need to do is, I'm just going to copy these things and I'll paste them at the beginning of the file. So that way when, oh, it looks like our program is running, but that way when all these definitions are at the top of the file, the program can store all those definitions for later. And then on line 23, when we first call the add function, our program will look in its memory and remember that add wants us to take the two numbers and put them together, and it'll call that function. So now we just need to do the same thing with everything else. We'll call subtract, and then we'll pass in num1 and num2. We need to call divide and pass in num1 and num2. And then we need to call multiply and pass in num1 and num2. And remember, num1 and num2 are just the variables that we took the input from, and we are just giving them to the add function. And then when we go all the way back up here to add, we're going to return num1 plus num2. And then finally, we're going to print out that result. So let's give our program a run and see if it works. So run the program. We'll say the first number we want to enter is 7. The second number we want to enter is 8. And let's say the operation is multiplication. So this should print out 56. There we go. So that worked. So let's try again. And this time let's do 8, 9, oh, 8, 0. I meant to enter 9. But let's do multiplication again. So that worked. So let's give it one more shot. Let's do some subtraction actually. Or let's do division. Let's do 64 divided by 4. That should give us 16. Yeah. So we see our program is working fine. There's obviously a couple more things that you could add to make it a bit more complicated, like I was talking about, adding floats, which remember is just like numbers with decimal points. You could add that so that you could do sort of more complex math. But this is sort of the basics of a calculator that we could use. So we've got all our main components here. We've broken our project down into sort of 3 main parts, or technically 4, using our comments again, which the program ignores. But what we've done is we've taken our input from the user, asking for 2 numbers. We asked for 2 numbers and an operation. We converted both of those numbers to integers so that we could do math with them, because in Python, the input function takes inputs as a string. We used conditional statements to determine the operation that was used, or the operation that the user requested, to choose between addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication. And we had a little bit of error handling, saying if the user didn't enter a valid operation, then we would print something telling them they didn't. And then finally, we wrote all the functions, and I can space these out so it's a little easier to read, but we wrote all the functions to handle all of the different operations that we want to do. So now, no matter what, even if I'm not doing it in a print statement here, I can call those functions whenever I need, if I want to add something, subtract something, or divide something. So that's the basics of a calculator, but in the next video, we'll talk about some more complex programming concepts that we can use in future projects.